Daryl Johnson is the guy who literally wrote the book and the report on extremism in this country. But all types of extremism, including white supremacist extremism. The only problem was his report was buried. He worked in the government at the time. He no longer does. He was a conservative at the time. His views have changed a little bit since then. He's now on the program. Daryl Johnson, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thank you, Cenk.
Appreciate you coming on. When I say you wrote the book on it, it's literal. Your book is Hateland, a long, hard look at America's extremist heart. And you're an interesting cat because you're not in these political battles on one side or another, as far as I can tell. So let's start from the beginning. What did you do in the government about 10 years ago?
Yeah, so I started my federal career looking at force protection issues for the U.S. Army here in the continental United States. This is before the Oklahoma City bombing in '95. 1995 was kind of a watershed event with Oklahoma City, and so I went ahead and took over the KONOS force protection desk, and later turned a career into looking at right-wing extremists as well as left-wing extremists and single-issue groups. Worked at ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms for a number of years, and led a team of analysts at Department of Homeland Security.
So I'm going to start in a curious place, which is left-wing extremism. Because right now there's tons of attacks from right-wing extremists, as you correctly predicted, which we're going to get to. But oftentimes people will talk about left-wing extremism, and it's obvious I'm missing something because I literally don't see it. There doesn't seem to be any massacres by left-wing zealots for the reason of left-wing extremism, but it must exist because you write about it, you guys studied it in the government and tracked it, et cetera. So what is it?
Yeah, so typically the FBI and Homeland Security, we categorize eco-terrorism, animal rights extremism, anarchist extremism, as well as black nationalism on the far left of the political spectrum, because the ideal goals of these groups is to get rid of the class distinctions in our country, to have a classless society. They want to redistribute wealth from the rich to the poor. We had a micro trend back in 2016 where some black nationalists were involved in some police ambushes and police officers were killed. That only lasted about a year and a half, where white nationalism has been around for decades, and they've been killing people for the past 10 years at least.
So those cop killings were obvious, that we can see, and I get that. So I was just wondering, because I hear about the eco-terrorists, the animal rights activists, but I mean, they're kidnapping pigs and stuff. And I've heard of a long time ago burning down SUV places, et cetera. But I'm not missing it today, right? I mean, in the sense that there isn't some sort of killings that's happening a lot, but we're just missing it from the left.
No, and when you hear the president say he wants to classify the Antifa movement as a terrorist organization, but totally neglects categorizing white nationalism as terrorism, he's got his priorities mixed up. When I studied the threat, the anarchists, the Antifa, yeah, they destroy property. Yeah, they're a nuisance when they come to town. They may burn an SUV or a limo or break windows of businesses, but they're not out there killing people in mass numbers like we saw this past week in El Paso and Gilroy.
So back during the Bush administration, not the Obama administration, your group wrote a report about right-wing extremism, right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so it all began in January 2007 with a call from the U.S. Capitol Police, who tipped us off that Senator Barack Obama was going to announce his run for president. They asked us to monitor the white nationalist websites to see if there was any threats directed at Senator Obama. We did that for them for about a month or so and didn't see anything. It was only when he won the Democratic nomination for president did we actually start seeing the threats. And there was actually a couple of assassination plots as well. So that's kind of where the report started.
And so at the time, were you some big liberal who wanted to blame the right wing in general and Republicans in general for non-existent threats?
No, I'm actually a third generation Republican, very conservative. I was raised a Mormon, spent 40 years of my life studying the Mormon theology and serving in all kinds of volunteer capacities. So I can identify the threat and call it out for what it is. So why can't our own Republican leaders?
Right. So you saw at that time in 2007 this beginning to take shape. So you guys wrote a report warning about it. Now you wrote it, if I'm not mistaken, mainly in the Bush administration, but it got released in the early part of the Obama administration. What happened next?
Yeah, that's correct. So it took us 18 months to compile the data, 6 months putting pen to paper, coordinated it with the FBI and all levels of Department of Homeland Security. We actually had 23 rewrites of that paper. So in April of 2009, I briefed the findings to Secretary Napolitano, which basically said, yes, we are seeing a rise in right-wing extremism, and it's primarily due to the unprecedented election of a first African-American president, as well as him being a Democrat, as well as the economic collapse that we had in 2008.
Mm-hmm. And how was that report received?
Yeah, so it was received very well by Napolitano. She thanked me for the brief. The FBI was there briefing their portion on what they were going to do about the problem. And so the report was released. The fusion centers and state and local law enforcement, it was well received among those audiences, and that's who it was intended for. But it ended up getting leaked and used as a political tool against the new administration. So my warning got lost in the political backslash and mudslinging.
So what'd they do with the report?
Well, the department had to actually apologize because the American Legion got offended that we pointed out rightfully that returning military veterans would be targeted by these extremist groups for recruitment. And then they actually rescinded the report, and they said initially they were going to send it out in a different form, but it never really took shape, and they never disseminated it again.
Yeah, and of course the real problem, in my opinion, was not the American Legion, it was Rush Limbaugh and Fox News. And the Obama administration could not stomach being yelled at by them. So definitely. I think, and I want to be clear, even before the Trump administration, it was a great act of cowardice by the Obama administration to withdraw that legitimate security report in the country. And it wasn't just about targeting Obama, it was about targeting American citizens. And now we've seen the results of that. So what then happened to your group that was tracking this?
Yeah, so initially they stopped all of our work. We had a number of trainings throughout the country that we were scheduled to give. We had one of our analysts actually training down at Quantico at the FBI Academy. I personally was training at the ATF Academy down in Glencoe, Georgia. We had other briefings and presentations scheduled. The National Sheriff's Association in Missouri had invited us. So all this work that we had done, all the reports that we were writing, all the training and presentations we were given was stopped. And we were initially told that it was just going to be a few months until this political firestorm died down. But all that did was give my leadership time to restructure the organization, and they shut down my unit and reassigned us to other tasks.
And when they shut it down, was anyone in the government at that point trying to track right-wing extremism to stop it?
Only the FBI has full-time resources devoted to this issue at the federal level.
But in terms of the Department of Homeland Security, totally shut down. So what wound up happening to your job?
Yeah, so I was reassigned. It was kind of insulting. I was reassigned to look at al-Qaeda threats to the United States. So I eventually saw the handwriting on the wall. The leadership started retaliating against us, saying that we had used poor analytical tradecraft in writing that report. So I went ahead and decided to resign and move on and start my consulting company.
So Daryl, that's interesting that you said it was insulting to be assigned to al-Qaeda extremism, because of course there's been Islamic extremist attacks in America as well. So why did you find that insulting?
Because I'd spent my whole federal career looking at domestic non-Islamic extremists. There are plenty of analysts at DHS and the FBI and CIA, NSA, the military services. I mean, there's literally hundreds of analysts that look at al-Qaeda, and just to have me reassigned was deliberately meant to kind of humiliate me.
Right, I understand. And so now, unfortunately, you've been proven correct, and there is one massacre after another by right-wing extremists, and that leads to the unfortunate question of, do you think that if the Department of Homeland Security had actually listened to that report and kept your team together, that of course you couldn't have stopped all of them, but is there a chance you might have been able to stop some of them?
I definitely believe so. And I've thought about that question for many months and even years, because it's been 10 years now. If we would have taken that report seriously, and if the US government would have spent the time to develop a countering white nationalism strategy back in 2009, we would have much more mature programs and much more money and resources invested that could stem the level of threat that we're currently seeing.
So finally, we've mainly been criticizing the Obama administration for giving in to nonsense political threats. But what did the Trump administration do when they took over?
Yeah, I will say one thing for Barack Obama's administration. They were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, you're under a Democratic leadership. These right-wing extremists, are afraid that Democrats are going to crack down on them and take their guns away. So if Obama and his administration would have done anything at the time, it would have just played right into these extremists' hands and given them more fuel to recruit and radicalize. As far as the Trump administration, I've been very disappointed. Typically during Republican administrations, we see a dial back in the level of activities by these right-wing extremist groups. And they're continuing to operate at a very heightened level because they feel this is a permissive environment. We have the President of the United States mainstreaming some of their extremist ideas that I saw 10 or 15 years ago on white nationalist websites. Ideas like building a border wall and mass deportation of immigrants, calling immigrants invaders, banning Muslims from traveling into the country. This is all mainstreaming of extremist ideas.
Yeah, and is the Department of Homeland Security back and revving on fighting right-wing extremism at this point after all the massacres?
There's been a lot of talk by the leadership, but there hasn't been any action as far as devoting more resources or hiring more people or devoting more grant funding to groups that could combat white nationalism through their countering violent extremism programs. There hasn't been anything yet. So I'm kind of curious to see if these latest round of attacks tends to spur somebody to action.
Actually, Daryl, let me ask you about a report that we broke. Ken Klippenstein at TYT Investigates broke the story, and he's got the internal documents from the FBI in this case saying that white supremacist extremism was a mid-level threat, but black extremism was the highest level threat. Does that make sense to you?
No, it doesn't. Like I said, we had that micro trend back in 2016, 2017. I don't know what the date of these documents are, but obviously police were very concerned about being ambushed, and some of those controversial police shootings had kind of reactivated the violent black nationalists here in this country. But fortunately, it only lasted a year.
Yeah, that seems to be perverse priorities given the amount of shootings that are happening and the amount of violence that is happening on the different sides here. All right, listen, if you guys want to find out more, the book Homeland, written by Daryl, has all of this and more. A long, hard look at America's extremist heart is what it's called. Homeland, check it out, by Daryl Johnson. Daryl, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.